Mari kita mulai mengurangi emisi gas rumah kaca Indonesia.
Ayo kita kurangi emisi gas rumah kaca 50% di tahun 2030.
Dan kita kurangi terus sampai akhirnya kita bisa mencapai nol emisi di tahun 2050.
Ayo hijaukan ekonomi kita, jaga hutan kita.
Jaga ekosistem laut kita.
Kembangkan energi bersih dan kurangi segala emisi karbon dalam kehidupan kita.
Sehingga Indonesia Emas 2045 akan hidup dalam bumi yang nyaman, sehat, dan bahagia.
Sehingga Indonesia dapat menjadi bagian penting dalam solusi global perubahan iklim.
Planet bumi harus kita sembuhkan dari sekarang.
Target besar dan mulia ini bisa kita capai.
Ayo kita bergotong royong.
Selamatkan planet bumi.
Selamatkan umat manusia.
Selamatkan generasi kita dan generasi seterusnya.
Kita sambut Indonesia Emas yang penuh harapan.
Selamatkan Indonesia 2045.
Sadarkah Anda, kita mungkin adalah generasi terakhir yang bisa hidup dalam dunia bercuaca normal. Kita juga adalah satu-satunya generasi yang bisa menyelamatkan umat manusia dari bahaya bumi mendidih yang menanti kita selamanya di depan. Ayo kita penuhi panggilan planet bumi, panggilan umat manusia, dan panggilan sejarah. Ayo sebarkan pesan ini dan tanda tangani petisi.
I would argue, and I've argued this consistently, is that the cost of inaction on climate change is far greater than the cost of action. You will be aware, the Stern review which came out, which said that, unabated climate change, we could be talking about a cost of up to 20% of global GDP.
Yeah.
That is a huge number. And we see this in our day-to-day lives, right? People will see what happens when there is flooding, what happens when sea level rises, the damage that does to lives and livelihoods. That is what we need to arrest now. And I think that's why. And I think there is this growing realization that we need to act now. I just want, over the next 5 months, for all countries to step up to the plate and say, right, we're going to act, we're going to put out ambitious targets, and we're going to put out an ambitious plan to deliver on this.
Good evening and welcome everybody to Muda Bersuara 2021 Closing Dialogue, Generation Z, Generation NZ, or Generation Net Zero. Today's fireside chat on krisis iklim, aktivisme, dan Gen Z, or climate crisis, activism, and Gen Z is the last installment in FPCI's youth-led climate dialogue marathon on the climate crisis. So today with us, we have Emma Bati Sukerta, who's going to be joining me in this fireside chat. Emma is a 17-year-old, someone who just turned 17 years old last month. She was raised in Jakarta, an aspiring youth environmental activist, though I would say that she's already an environmental activist. She is the co-head of Bye Bye Plastic Bags Jakarta, the co-founder of Mari Kita Bahas, a member of Trash Hero Bali. She previously also wrote for Project Buzz Indonesia. Previously, she was also involved with Jaga Rimba and Fridays for Future Digital. She makes educational TikTok on social and environmental global issues, and her video to clean up Bali's beach actually garnered almost, if not beyond, 2 million views on TikTok. She has been a pescatarian for 11 years and a vegan for 5 years, which I think is an amazing feat on top of her already amazing and accomplished CV. So Emma, thanks for joining us. How are you today?
Hi, sir. I'm doing good. I'm pretty good today.
Good, great. So are you in Jakarta right now, or are you somewhere else?
I'm currently in Bali. I'm trying to decide every week. My flight home to Jakarta gets postponed, both because I don't necessarily want to go home, but also because of FPCI, of course. So I'm currently at my home in Bali because I'm Balinese, but I was raised in Jakarta. So I'm actually probably going back to Jakarta this week. But yeah, all activism, school online, everything from Bali.
Well, we're so pleased to have you. Nevertheless, it's already 8 p.m. It's one hour later than Jakarta, so thanks for joining us despite how late it is over there. Okay, so let me just go straight and ask you the first question. The title for today's fireside chat is on Gen Z, or Generation Net Zero. Talking about Gen Z, I'm wondering, can you share with us what really distincts your generation or the Generation Z from the older generation, which are the millennials or the Generation X, boomers, so on and so forth? What are the key features and strengths for specifically for activism and campaigns that your generation has?
Yeah, I definitely think there are several different things, though very similar. There are several different things that distinguish the difference between Gen Z and, let's say, millennials and the generations before that. The difference, I think, with Gen Z is particularly the how accustomed we are to the media and how accustomed we are to our digital technology at such a young age. Especially with the pandemic going on, everyone's kind of reliant on technology, and we're able to luckily enough have these skills at such a young age and be able to take advantage of that. And I think that's something that a lot of people are starting to see increase with as the pandemic started. I've definitely seen a lot of my fellow friends and a lot of fellow students in my school and schools all around Jakarta specifically start to really utilize Instagram and TikTok and different platforms online for climate activism and for any kind of activism in general. And I think that's one thing that's it really stems as something that's different for Gen Z. But I also think it's the fact that we are one of the youngest, basically the youngest generation here while we're trying to fight climate change. Like, our fate has been quite written for us, as well as the generations ahead of us. And I feel we're the youngest generation at the moment to tackle climate change, because we're at a reasonable age where we're able to do so. We're not too young yet, we're not too old. And so I definitely think, we are facing climate change, and we're told that climate change is coming in the future at such a young age that it's already written for us. It's already in the future. It's already going to happen for us in the future. And I think that's really scary. And that's something that, the past generations never necessarily had. And it wasn't as big of a danger. I mean, it wasn't as much of a threat. And so definitely Gen Z, I think, our involvement in the climate change movement is different for other generations, because we have to start now. We can't wait until we're a little bit older. We have to start now, because if we don't, then nothing will happen, nothing will change. And, we'll be facing a future of climate change that's irreversible, unfortunately. So I definitely think kind of got the weaker hand there, but that's what I reckon is the difference between Gen Z and other generations before that in relation to climate change.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you brought up. I'd like to pick on something that you said, which is that your generation is probably the most informed generation ever because you have unlimited access to the internet, to media. And can you share what are your thoughts about like cutting through all the noise and really just getting, getting informed on what is climate change? And, I have to add as well, Indonesia, our country, is on top of the list that hosts climate deniers in the world. Isn't that just kind of concerning? But our country also hosts, I think, quite a big number, a big portion of the young population. So, what are your thoughts on that?
One thing I definitely think that our youth has that's different than other generations, especially, and why it's important and vital for the climate change movement is that we're still very young. As obviously we're Gen Z, we're still very young, meaning that our values and what we know and what we believe in the world it's constantly changing. Of course, everyone is, but ours at such a young age is always is most vulnerable. I feel like in comparison to most other generations and people of other ages. Like you were saying, Indonesia has a lot of climate deniers. And those values are going to be a lot stronger because they've been there for years. Whereas I feel specifically, with Gen Z and raising awareness on climate change, we're lucky enough to be able to kind of have the mind and have an open mind to change our opinion on climate change and to further grow passions within other kids. Youth activists. The main goal, of course, not only is to kind of direct and push governments, but it's mainly as well, in my opinion, is to inspire and to grow a passion in other kids and in other Gen Z people to contribute as well to climate change movement. And because I think we're so young and because we have so much access to the media and we're constantly being fed information, if it's the right information, we're lucky enough to hopefully be changing the minds of others to join the movement. And I think that's why the Gen Z has such an important role in the climate change movement and has become such a vital member, I guess, as a community in the movement, because we're so strong together, because we've slowly grown a community of which we are strongly against climate change. And I think that has a lot to do with the media, and that has a lot to do with the information and the news that is being fed towards us. I think our most of the sources that we read from are going to be from fellow Gen Z members and from fellow youth activists. And unfortunately, most of the youth activists that we look up to are not climate change deniers. They're people who are involved in the climate change movement. Whereas, typically we see people who are climate change deniers, or people who tend to ignore it, or, don't want to face the hard facts, are ones that look at, for example, sources like Fox News or Donald Trump. So I think Gen Z and the relation it has to the media definitely is what makes it extremely strong and extremely vital in the climate change movement. And that's why, I'm here, I do what I do. And that's why all my fellow members in BBPB and Mari Kita Bahas, that's why we do what we do, is so then we can get other people to join us, because we know that with the platforms and with the access to information Gen Z has, we do have a bigger chance, I feel, to encourage the average citizen to change their lifestyle to be more eco-friendly and to join the movement in comparison to other generations, if that makes sense.
Yeah, another thing that came to mind is, obviously the the young people's generation are doing a lot, not only on climate issues, but also on social issues, racial issues, everything it is. There are so many global movements that are led by young people. My question is, do you think that the young people are involved enough in the decision making? Because we could just be talking to avoid, we could just be talking in silos amongst ourselves.
Like when it comes to Gen Z and the youth, unfortunately, as much as we want to say that we have as much power as the government and as much power as big corporations, I feel together, of course, we are very strong, and we are very, we do have a very, very big voice that can make changes. It would be a lot easier if the government just came to those decisions and came to those conclusions on their own, right? But I think to get our and to get a say in what happens, specifically in regards to policies, regulations. We have to make really, really big claims and really, really big events, as well as statements. And that requires a lot of power, and that requires a lot of people and a lot of communities working together. Whereas, an example, if you have one really major big politician up there saying it, sometimes it could make the same impact. So unfortunately, Gen Z, we do have to work a lot harder, I feel, to get recognized and to get a say in what happens within government regulations and within government decisions. But I think that's something that all generations will have to face when they're facing a climate or facing a movement at this age. And unfortunately, that kind of ageism issue is kind of involved there. But as we see youth activists slowly grow and slowly become more popular, Greta Thunberg, of course, I love her, everyone loves her. We start to see an improvement on the ways Gen Z and on the ways our youth is being involved. But unfortunately, I feel like, of course, it's not enough, and there's not enough. And there will always be the arguments that, we're not experts and we don't know enough. But, it is our future as much as it is yours. So I definitely think we should have a say on what happens. And I think that's why the movement has become so strong over the past several years, because we've been denied the opportunity to be involved in these decisions. And so we're trying to make the opportunity for ourselves because the government isn't giving it to us. Does that make sense?
Definitely, yeah. And I'd like to refer to, I think this is what they have in Denmark. They have a national youth council, all youth-led. They have I don't know, some 70 youth organizations, and they can actually recommend, policies straight to the climate minister over there. So, if only Indonesia has something like that, right? Let me intervene a little bit with some of the questions that we've received from the audience. This is from Ayudia and Leah from Bali. How do you cope with eco-anxiety? And perhaps you can give a little bit of a background about what is eco-anxiety for some of our audience out there who might not be familiar with the term yet.
Yeah, definitely. I think eco-anxiety is something that a lot of people are facing, and I think something that the attitude towards climate change and the attitude towards our environment and the way it's changing and the way it's decreasing, our biodiversity is decreasing, is quite extreme, and it can be quite scary. I think the idea that our climate is changing, and the idea that we could, of natural disasters and everything, can be so extreme that people tend to ignore it, and that people tend to disregard climate change and disregard what's happening and the information right in front of us. And I think people will deal with eco-anxiety in different ways. But I personally think that, as a youth and as a member of the Gen Z community, I know that there are so many others out there who are fighting for the same thing I am. And I think something that any kind of anxiety in general about any movement, about anything, about schoolwork, about anything, as long as you have a team and a community out there that you can kind of relate with, it makes it a lot easier, and it makes it a lot more comforting to know that there's a group out there, and you're not alone. And I know that sounds kind of cliche, but I feel like it's true, and it needs to be said, it needs to be stated. And so I find comfort in my core teams of my NGOs and my friendship groups who I talk about climate with. And so I think just knowing that it's a whole community out there makes it a lot easier to face eco-anxiety straight on. So I mean, it can be seen in different ways, but for me, from my perspective, that's kind of how I face it typically. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned a good point there, which is you find comfort in knowing that you're doing something for the earth, for the climate, for the planet. You have all these NGOs and then all these social movements that you are part of. But at the end of the day, I think you and I and everybody else both know that that's not enough. So what would be enough to actually tackle the climate crisis?
I think, you know, we can never really know what will be enough until we have seen that change, until I don't think it can ever get to that point. I don't think I personally, I can't say, because one, I'm not an expert on that, but also two, I think we've had so much damage done that it's going to take so much effort to not only stop climate change, because at the moment, one of the biggest goals that all nations and everything we're looking at, you know, the Paris Agreement, most national kind of cooperation programs, regulations, one of the biggest things we're looking at is trying not to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius and trying not to go over that and 2 degrees Celsius. And so when we look at if anything will ever be enough, we have to look at not only trying not to reach 1.5 Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius, but what are we going to do? You know, if we do start to cool down the earth, what are we going to do with all the damage that we've already done? And, you know, what will our world look like then? And so I personally don't know if anything will ever be enough, because I don't know what the future looks like. You know, I don't know whether or not nations will put in more effort to cooperate or whether they won't, whether big corporations will begin to cooperate more, whether they won't. I personally cannot tell you. I hope that, you know, get to the point where we're like, I think we've done enough, to the point where it's no longer a crisis. It's no longer a climate change crisis. But yeah, I personally can't tell you. All I can say is that if we want to reach that, there's going to have to be major changes. In Indonesia, a lot specifically, but in all nations around the world. So,
yeah, I agree with you there. A lot of transformative changes, systemic changes need to happen. And right now, I think our government is not doing enough. Just like all the participants here at Muda Bersuara know that we're not doing enough. So another dimension to the climate issue, especially this year and last year, is that there's COVID-19. And we know that the global pandemic hit us like a disaster. Nobody expected it. But do you think that due to COVID-19 activism, especially climate activism, has been curbed? Or do you think that it actually flourishes even more?
Know how to do climate change. First of all, I think Gen Z more than any generation know how to do climate change online, because of like I was saying before, like how we're accustomed to the media and being online. And, you know, because online is where we live and breathe. You know, it's the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning. It's the last thing I do before I go to bed. And although the pandemic has impeded things in some ways, for example, we're unable to, you know, go to marches on the street. We're unable to physically meet up together. We're unable to physically go to, you know, give petitions to the government. In some ways it hasn't, and of course it hasn't stopped us. And you can see that based on the online campaigns and the fact that we still regularly meet and talk and spread news about the climate change. For example, this whole campaign, the FPCI, you know, your whole campaign is an example of the way that it's not being stopped, and that we're facing climate change, and we're facing the movement just from a different way and in a different perspective. And at first, a lot of people were doubting the way that we're going to be tackling climate change online. But I think a lot of people are starting to find the benefits of online and starting to utilize the ways in which we can use our online media as well as our online access to be involved in the climate change movement. And the pandemic as well has taught us in some ways, brought the forefront on the very issue of climate change, as some scientists believe that the rise in superbugs is also a result of mankind. And so I definitely think there are pros and cons to climate change and then the climate change movement as a result of the pandemic. You know, one other point I want to make is the way that the pandemic has allowed people to be online more, which means more access to information, which means more access to information on climate change, more news, more raising awareness. But unfortunately, it also means more access to fake news. And it means more access for citizens who follow climate deniers to spread their ideology as well, which we have seen, for example, if we look at the US presidential election, the idea of climate change became political. It became, if you're left wing, you believe in climate change. If you're right wing, you don't believe in climate change. And that can be really scary, and that can be really manipulative. So, and I think that was one of the result of the pandemic, is because we're online, people can be manipulated to think a certain way about climate change, and that can alter the movement. So I definitely think the pandemic has changed the movement in many ways, for better and for worse. But it won't stop anyone, I don't think. I mean, it won't stop any activist, definitely.
Yeah, and again, you drew a very important point there, which is a clear distinction between what's happening in Indonesia and what's happening in the US on climate issues. In America, climate issue is very much an electoral issue. You choose your president based on their climate agenda. If they're a climate denier, you won't vote for them. Or if they are a climate denier, then you will support them, right? Whereas in Indonesia, we're not at that point yet. More often than not, the climate issue or the environmental issues are always pushed aside to the margins. So I guess my next question is, how do we make sure that this becomes an electoral issue, especially coming towards the 2024 presidential election?
I definitely think that the idea and the values towards climate change in older generations is lacking. Climate change deniers, unfortunately, there's a big community of climate change deniers in Indonesia. And when it comes to elections and whether or not it's involved in politics, if we want climate change to be a political issue, we want it to be a political issue for the better and not for the worse. We don't want it to become a political issue in which, climate change isn't, like, for example, in the US, climate change should have been a topic that would be discussed on both levels. It should have been, I will pick my president based on which one has the best climate change approach, instead of which one is a climate change denier and which one isn't, right? So ideally, it should have been approached in a different way, and climate change should be a priority instead of a tactic to manipulate the minds of the citizens. And so if we do want climate change to be a political issue, a political conversation in Indonesia, we want it to be for the better and not for the worse. And I think one of the reasons it's not currently a political issue, either good or bad, is because it's not talked about enough from the government to the communities. And it's not something that I feel the government is transparent enough about, not only about what they're doing, but also about the direct impacts it has on Indonesia. For example, our flooding rates, our deforestation. When we look at how much our government is communicating with us, we definitely need to see an increase in that in Indonesia specifically, before it can become any sort of political game or something that's involved in politics, because no one will understand it unless it's discussed by the government and discussed by politicians towards our communities. And unfortunately, that's lacking. And unfortunately, because of the lack of discussion, most of our older generations it's going to take a lot more convincing, because they do have their old cultural values and probably a lot of conservative values put in place about climate change. So I think in Indonesia, our situation here in comparison to, let's say, a lot of European nations or the US, for example, it's very different. Also culturally, it's very different in what we discuss and what we don't discuss. So it's going to need a lot more cooperation with the government and the communication between the government and the communities to start to allow it to be a talk in politics that is more significant.
And so to your point, my personal observation, it seems that Indonesia is doing its climate approach or climate plans because all of the other countries are doing it, because everybody has come to the global to the international roundtable saying that, hey, we're going to commit to this, and that's why Indonesia does it. But not because that they see there's something that this issue is something that will affect their actual constituents come in the future. Or perhaps they know of the effects already, but they have not taken it seriously yet. Okay, it's an interesting discussion indeed. So let me go to my next question. An interesting feature of Generation Z is that they could be the first generation to ever live in a net zero world. Like right now, we're still living in a world which is full of emissions, but potentially later in 2050, 2060, 2070, we could live in a world that has zero carbon. So what are your hopes for that? What actions can be taken for that?
A net zero emission world. God, we can only wish, really. But I think when people say that Gen Z will be the first generation to live in a net zero emissions world, we have to think about whether or not we will get there. Firstly, whether or not we'll actually reach a net zero emissions and whether or not we'll reach net zero actually. And for those who are unaware, net zero emissions is when GHG emissions, where global greenhouse gas emissions released by humans are counterbalanced with the removing of greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. And this can be also known as like carbon removal. So basically it's trying to reduce our carbon emissions and trying to create a more net zero amount of emissions within our atmosphere, which will ultimately help slow down the rates of climate change, maybe even avoid climate change. But I think when we think of net zero, I think it's one of the issues that is involved in climate change, which is carbon emissions. As much carbon emissions is as big as an issue as deforestation, plastic waste, fashion waste, food waste. And I think what's interesting is that, under the Paris Agreement, countries have agreed to limit warming well below 2 degrees, ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius. And there have been over 50 countries that have communicated such net zero targets, including largest emitters of the world, China and the United States. And so there's been a lot of talk about net zero emissions, about reaching net zero emissions. But I personally will not believe it until I see it. And I think there have been many nations who have reduced their carbon emissions substantially, and props to them. But I feel like we are reaching a lot, like I was saying this morning in the press conference, there's a lot more failures than there are successes, and we kind of ignore the failures just because there are successes. By that, I mean, we can't just because there are successes in some nations, we can't ignore the nations that are failing, and we can't use that as an excuse to lower the goal. So instead of lowering the goal and the achievement, and instead of slowly, incrementally getting to a net zero emissions kind of community in the world, we need to stick with the same goal and increase more aggressive policies and more aggressive regulations, or else we're never going to make it in time because we're now on a timer. We only have allegedly 7 years left, which many scientists believe is not enough time. And so when it comes to net zero emissions, I personally think it will take global cooperation and global efforts. And until like the Paris Agreement, that was a great first step, but until we can see countries actually living up to this agreement and living up to their own agreements that they've made and promises that they've made to their own nation, like Indonesia's what we were talking about this morning, the carbon agreement that they made by 2050. Until we start to see actual changes individually by each nations, then I think we'll start to really look, and we'll start to see a net zero community and a net zero world. But that doesn't necessarily have to mean that all nations have to reach net zero at the same time. I think we need to look at the biggest emitters around the world and the biggest nations and the ones that emit the most, specifically, China, the United States, and get them to take the first step. And they need to reach net zero first before others, because I think those are the most important. And unless they can, unless the biggest emitters can reach net zero, I think our world doesn't really stand a chance in regards to carbon emissions and the way it's impacting our atmosphere.
Interesting inputs. And I'd like to just share this bit of information to all of our audience who are watching us right now, which is that under current policy scenario, which is if we just keep on doing what we're doing right now, we will overshoot, we will cross that 3 degree Celsius warming by 2100. And even if current climate commitments are implemented, that will still bring us to 2.4 degrees Celsius by 2100, which is a little bit crazy, and which is why Emma earlier said that we need an even more progressive, even more ambitious climate commitments. Because right now it's just not, it's just not fulfilling it. And one of the key to do that is, of course, to have Indonesia. And I think we have a responsibility here because we are one of the largest economies in the world. We have the 3rd largest rainforest in the world as well. We are such an economic powerhouse, so we should be able to live up to those responsibilities. We have to target net zero emissions by 2050. That's what the science is saying. That's what IPCC has said. That's what the research has been saying, because this is really a make or break moment. Let me intervene a little bit with a question from our audience. This is from Kaya from Jakarta. What advice would you give to other young women who want to work for climate justice or maybe just the climate arena?
Okay. Firstly, I just want to say I think this is my best friend, Kaya. If it is, hi, Kaya. This is one of my best friends back home in Jakarta. She said she'd be watching, and I didn't think she'd actually watch, but yeah. So back to the question, for other young women who want to get involved, I think one thing is that a lot of people tend to think that to be involved in the climate change movement, you have to be running an NGO, you have to be publicly speaking in campaigns, you have to be out there a lot, and you have to be there's this specific idea of what an activist is. And I think a lot of people tend to hesitate and tend to not get involved in the movement because of that idea. But simple things like there's a lot of different NGOs, and I'm just talking specifically about Jakarta. There's a lot of different organizations that you can join just as like a content writer, as a graphics designer. I think those things are those people, and people who are involved in any kind of NGO are just as significant as people like Greta Thunberg, because all little things count. But I always bring this up in every single interview, any kind of webinar. I talk about youth activism and how you can get involved. Is I always discuss about how I have a twin sister. Fun fact: her name is Bella in Jakarta. She's currently in Jakarta at the moment, and if you know me, I'm an extreme extrovert, extreme extrovert, whereas my twin sister is an extreme introvert. She is one of the most introverted people I know. But I like to think of us both as climate activists, but we're activists in many different ways, and we contribute to the movement in different ways. And I think both of them are very significant. For example, I run Biopass Bags Jakarta. I talk about environmental activism on my TikTok page, as well as my Kita Bahas. And, I talk in webinars, for example, whereas my sister, she talks about it within her friend group and within her family group, and she educates herself, and she educates the people around her, and she reduces her AC usage. She, just like me, we're pescatarian for 11 years. I've been vegan this year 6 years. Both of us have been doing that. And so I think she's as much of a climate activist as I am. And I think a lot of people tend to hesitate from joining the movement, or even just joining an NGO, or following other NGOs, because they tend to think there's this specific idea of what you have to do to be actually involved in the movement. Whereas I think, it's very cliche to say, but, baby steps and small steps actually do make big differences. But as long as you personally, as an individual, are making those steps to better your lifestyle, to make it more eco-friendly, and influence others around you, then I think that is definitely one way that people, especially young women, are able to contribute towards the climate change movement.
A strong encouragement right there. So maybe Kaya, you should go join an NGO now, based on her encouragement. Okay, so this will be my last question. We've talked extensively about misinformation, disinformation, climate deniers, and the fact that in Indonesia, it's still not an electoral issue. So What would you say to climate deniers? Say if I'm a climate denier, what would you say to me?
I mean, what I would truly say, we'd have to bleep. No, I'm kidding. We'd have to
Politely,
bleep out.
of course.
I mean, there's lots that I'd love to say to climate deniers. I just want to add before I talk about what I would say to climate deniers. It's something that I have been facing, not specifically on climate change, but just deniers for since I was very, very young. Unfortunately, like I was just saying before, I turned vegan when I was 11, and thankfully now it's become quite a trend, and a lot of people are asking me for like tips and stuff. But when I was 11, it was seen as taboo and something that was very, very, very odd. And I actually grew up not eating meat of any kind. I was pescatarian, and specifically in Indonesia, when most of your dishes are based around chicken and meat, there were a lot of people who did not believe that my lifestyle was a healthy lifestyle, and they didn't want to look at the reports, and they didn't want to look at studies that have been proven that the vegan lifestyle is the healthier lifestyle, more environmentally friendly lifestyle, and humanitarian, morally right lifestyle, I guess, if you want to say. And so I've had to deal with deniers of my kind of lifestyle for a very long time, and my values. And so I think it's quite very similar when you think about climate change. Climate change deniers. And so what I'd say to climate change deniers is that they've completely lost the argument and basically are no longer relevant. As in, people can no longer deny climate change anymore, as much as they can deny that smoking causes cancer. It's something that was once denied as a truth long ago, very, very strongly. We know how they operate. In the past, deniers contended the world is not warming, and overwhelming evidence from around the world has made arguments so fallacious that deniers then shift their argument to claim that humans are responsible for the warming. That tends to happen a lot with climate deniers. And because of the basic physics of greenhouse gases, it has been well established, and along with the fact that human activity has generated billions of tons of greenhouse gases, this argument became unattainable. And then, of course, the denier argument shifted further. Some deniers now conceded that warming will occur, but the impacts will be minimal, will be quite small. And some argue that even climate change will have impacts, but it will cost too much to do anything about it. It won't cost us enough. But of course, we know that the cost of failing to act will be much higher than if we don't. And so, I personally would just say goodbye to climate change deniers, because I think, what are they backing? What's backing their claims versus what's backing my claims, and what's backing the claims of people who do believe in the climate change movement? I think ours is much stronger. And I think, like climate change deniers, people who do believe in climate change, we do get our information from somewhere. We do get our values. Why I believe climate change is a real thing is because I have knowledge, and I have reports, and I have my reasons for it. And people who deny climate change also have their reasons. And unfortunately, a lot of that also has to do with who they're looking up to and who they're following, politically who they follow, their household. And so that's why it brings me again to Gen Z, because I think as a young generation, our minds are more vulnerable to changes in values and changes in decisions as we're and under our parents' wings, I so to say. And that's why I think our generation is specifically extremely significant within the movement of climate change, because I think it's easier to sway Gen Zs from climate change deniers to climate change. I wouldn't want to say climate change believers, because that would, insinuate that you believe in climate change and you want it to happen, but you know what I mean. So yeah, I definitely think that the Gen Z involvement in climate change is extremely significant for that kind of in that regards, and that climate change deniers can, you've kind of lost this one now. Like the amount of research that there is to back climate change. If you don't believe it, then what do you believe in? Do you believe in science? And I just tend to, what kind of values do you have? And so there's a lot I want to say towards climate change deniers, but at the moment they're not my biggest concern. My biggest concern is climate change and climate change in itself. And if people are going to get in the way, then you just got to find a way. You just got to tell them what's what and work around it, I reckon. That's not our biggest issue at the moment.
Great. Well, there you have it. The cost of inaction is greater than the cost of action. And second, climate change should be the least of our concern. Our top concern should be actually trying to mitigate climate risks. And to do that, we have to commit to a progressive and ambitious climate commitment. Okay, well, thank you so much, Emma, for joining us in this fireside chat. It's been such a pleasure to have you here with us. And for our audience, before we really wrap up this discussion, I'd like to share something that have been formulated by our Generasi Emas. There are student representatives who have been co-hosting the Muda Bersuara dialogues. They've drafted a joint statement, and I think it is such a moving, aspirational, and just simply visionary statement. So let me give the floor over to them.
Pernyataan sikap Muda Bersuara 2021, selamatkan generasi emas 2045 dari krisis iklim, 16 Agustus 2021. Menjelang Hari Kemerdekaan Republik Indonesia tanggal 17 Agustus 2021, melalui perhelatan Muda Bersuara, kami, putra dan putri Indonesia yang mengaku bertumpah darah yang satu, tanah air Indonesia, mengimbau bangsa Indonesia, pemerintah, dan rakyat Indonesia
untuk mencegah ancaman perubahan iklim dan mengambil bagian penting dalam upaya global untuk menjaga kenaikan suhu bumi hanya sekitar 1,5 derajat Celcius sesuai dengan visi Perjanjian Paris tahun 2015.
Kami putra dan putri Indonesia yang mengaku berbangsa yang satu, bangsa Indonesia, mengimbau pemerintah untuk menetapkan target baru
yang berdasarkan data ilmiah dan selaras dengan langkah dunia, yaitu menurunkan 50% emisi nasional di tahun 2030 dan mencapai net zero emission di tahun 2050.
Kami, putra dan putri Indonesia yang menjunjung bahasa persatuan, bahasa Indonesia, mengimbau bahwa konsep net zero emission harus menjadi suatu jargon publik dan politik.
Yang merakyat, yang disuarakan secara kolektif dan konsisten. Ini adalah harga mati untuk menyelamatkan generasi kami, generasi emas 2045.
Yang penting dalam net zero emission bukan saja target angka penurunan, namun juga jangka waktunya. Target net zero emission di tahun 2070 atau di tahun 2060 tidak lagi memadai.
Ini karena jatah karbon kita untuk menjaga kenaikan suhu bumi sebatas 1,5 derajat Celcius hanya sampai 2050. Oleh karena itu, Indonesia harus bisa menetapkan target penurunan emisi yang lebih ambisius, yaitu net zero emission di tahun 2050.
Target net zero emission ini merupakan kepentingan nasional kita sendiri untuk menyelamatkan Indonesia Emas 2045 dari berbagai bencana yang akan timbul dari suhu bumi yang terus memanas, yaitu cuaca ekstrim, banjir, kekeringan, krisis pangan, kekurangan stok air, kenaikan permukaan laut setinggi 1 meter, kegagalan panen, serta kebakaran hutan.
Dengan demikian, jelas bahwa krisis iklim merupakan ancaman eksistensial atau existential threat yang nyata bagi bangsa Indonesia. Berubah paradigma dan strategi pembangunan ini memang tidak mudah.
Namun, taruhannya adalah masa depan kami dan masa depan keselamatan bangsa Indonesia. Maka dari itu, sudah seharusnya kita semua menuntut perjuangan yang berat.
Jangan sampai sejarah mencatat pemanasan suhu bumi secara drastis di tahun 2045 akibat kegagalan generasi Anda dalam melakukan perubahan dan terjebak dalam perdebatan bertele-tele.
Sudah waktunya kita mengusung nasionalisme iklim, climate nationalism, di mana kecintaan dan kebanggaan kita terhadap bangsa Indonesia bersatu padu dengan perjuangan yang gigih untuk mencegah ancaman perubahan iklim terhadap masa depan Indonesia. Salam kami, Generasi Emas 2045.
There you have it. Thank you so much again to Emma and then to the organizers of Muda Bersuara, as well as to the 21 universities who have been so amazing in cooperating and also in hosting the 10 dialogues that we had until today. I'm very pleased to let you know that we have successfully ended the Muda Bersuara marathon dialogues. We've hosted 30 climate experts on 10 topic discussions, and as of today, we have reached up about 8,500 participants, I've been told. So thank you again to everybody. Thank you as well to Emma again. It's such a pleasure to have you. And I think we've covered a lot of topics. Hopefully the young generation who are watching this right now is inspired to take further climate action. Thanks, Emma. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys.